Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center Cinema Roundtable. I always have to do that. We've been doing this for over 20 years. And I want to thank everybody in the Wilson Center, Nicholas Allen, Winnie Smith, especially Lloyd Winstead, who's been with me since the very beginning on these, and Dave Maher, who's monitoring today's event for us, and may occasionally break in if he has any great questions for us. Yeah, we've been doing this for a long time. The goal is to come up with an interdisciplinary kind of topic that students and faculty and staff quite often from around campus might be interested in doing. We usually do them on 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon because there are a few class conflicts and we can get a good room. But as I said last fall with the Boardwell Thompson visit, unfortunately that doesn't matter in the virtual world. I just came running downstairs after my class up in the big balcony theater to do this. So thank you for coming out. What we're going to do is, again, the format is it's really simple. That each of the panelists will take a few minutes to say something. What's compelling about the topic to them? What observations do they have for initial comments? Then we'll sort of talk among ourselves for a little bit, and we will answer as soon as, especially if I remember to look at Q&As, we'll answer questions and comments as well and respond to them down in the Q&A section also. So I hope that's a good start. Hopefully everybody's read the blurb, what we're really interested in. And I do want to thank my colleagues, especially Christopher Sieving, for not only recommending, saying, Gianna, be good, why don't we do a panel on? But I've had several colleagues in Grady as well who've been really helpful about coming up with a good topic and recommending people on it. So I'm thrilled that I didn't know where Kelsey was. So I'll just introduce briefly. We don't introduce long biographies and things at this because sometimes what somebody's famous for might not be the reason they even want to talk today. But I'll start just by looking at Neil Landau. This is his first year here. He's our screenwriter for the new Master in Fine Arts graduate program in production and film and television. If you want more information, you can write to Neil or me about that. So we welcome him to UGA. Again, it's his first year here, his first round table. Kate Fortmueller, who's just below him on my screen anyway. Kate Fortmueller, also in Grady College, Entertainment Media Studies. She's a specialist on labor in Hollywood and works on the industry today in lots of different levels. So she's particularly pertinent to today since she's been writing a book about this topic that's about to come out. And Gilbert is their colleague also in Grady College in EMST, and also another industry person, lots of insights, has just given a conference paper on topics that overlap with this. So I'm thrilled to have Anne contributing today with us as well. And then two people who are a little younger than me because they're former students. First, Kelsey Cunningham, who's working at Hulu at the moment, and we'll want to hear more about that. And we've got lots of students out there who would love these kind of gigs and good jobs. And so you were in both entertainment and media studies and film studies, I believe. Same thing with Gianna. Jianna Justice was the film major. And Gianna started with A24, the distributor. Has done many of my favorite movies in the last 5 years, and has moved on to Netflix as well. She's participated in a couple of events talking to our students in the last year or so, and we really appreciate her input as well. And I appreciate everybody taking the time. We appreciate all of you out there. We're all really tired of looking at computer screens and little boxes, so I really appreciate you doing this. So we're going to get this kicked off. We want to talk about, COVID, but in terms of like what it has really meant so far that we can assess. It's been disruptive, as we all know, in lots of different ways. Kate has her Cine t-shirt on. Kate and I are both on the board of the Cine movie theater. So we know practically for Athens what it's meant for movie theaters, but we're really curious about globally, but especially nationally for the industry. So Kate, do you want to get us started by saying a few things about
Yes. Yeah. So I will share my, I'll plug my forthcoming book. So yeah. Okay. So as mentioned, last fall, I wrote I'll say a short book about the effects of the first 9 months of the pandemic. So really actually kind of starting with shutdowns in China in January of 2020, and then ending with the release of Tenet and Mulan, sort of thinking about that period as kind of an initial like gestation period for Hollywood figuring out what they were going to do as things continued to kind of drag on. through the fall. And I'm sure this will kind of come up. There were obviously some really kind of significant changes, such as Warner announcing that they were going to put their entire 2021 slate onto their streaming service in December, which really shook things up. But I actually just kind of wanted to start with sort of a few general points and to sort of take us back, as much as I'm sure you guys all want to go back to March 2020, but to think back a little bit about where we started and what that moment kind of felt like when everything was shutting down. So February 28th, if you were reading Variety Hollywood Reporter, there was an article that said studios assembling strategy teams, which was basically the studios kind of announcing that they were sort of looking into this. There were a number of different articles, and I think, like myself included, many people were not really sure what to expect from COVID-19. There were a lot of comparisons to SARS, but nobody really expected things to kind of play out the way they did and the speed at which they did. So starting March 10th, we have the beginnings of shutdowns. Tom Hanks announces that he's COVID positive on March 11th. March Madness shuts down on March 12th, right? So to kind of think to this is not just about scripted film and television productions shutting down, but this is kind of media culture as we know it, whether that's sports to films, really shuts down in March. And then everything kind of falls apart even further on March 19th and 20th when New York and LA announced their shelter-in-place orders. So a few things I kind of want to say just generally about this particular book. One, I think it's important to kind of think about when we're talking about all these movies that went to streaming, that's not necessarily what studios want to do, especially for their big budget, the Mulans, the Tenants of the world. But Hollywood was always going to have to, and we were always going to have to kind of reconcile the shifting role of streamers in this industry. The pandemic just shifted and sped up a lot of these timelines. These were all things that were going to happen. They were not supposed to happen within 9 months, but they were all supposed to happen. The other thing that I think is particularly important, I think, sort of just as a general point about this, is that the pandemic was not experienced equally by everyone in Hollywood, which maybe should go without saying, but I just kind of want to underscore, I think we hear a lot about what's happening with conglomerates, but actually those are the ones who really benefit the most they are able to accommodate disruption the best, I guess is what I would say. They weren't prepared to make these shifts quickly, but they're diversified companies. They were rolling out their streaming services in 2020 anyways. And so all of this, sorry, I believe that was my screen. All of this was something that they were kind of already thinking about. So I guess that's my way of saying on some level, don't panic, that some of this stuff was going to happen anyways. And so from the position of don't panic, we can sort of maybe have a more productive conversation, Q&A, about sort of the ramifications of these changes and what really is significant versus what was kind of going to happen anyways, and how do we then regroup. I would say from sitting at Cine and having these conversations with Richard and other folks over the summer, I do really think that theaters are in a particular, need to be inventive at this stage to think about sort of what they do and what they offer. I do not have the answer to what they need to do, but this is really a time for reinvention. So for those of you looking to go into the media industries, bring your fresh perspectives. This is your moment. So I will pass it off to someone else.
How optimistic! This is your moment. And in fact, I'll just mention somebody that some of you know, one of our former students, Chris Wells, who does special effects on all kinds of marvelous movies, was just here a week or two ago, meeting with one of Mike Hussey's classes, and we just chatted a minute in the hallway, and he said one thing that's not going to change, especially this is since Kate works on labor, etc. He says one thing that's not going to change is this distance working. That it's just become so amazing how much stuff is actually getting done from individual places, and how much of that's going to continue to decentralize in some ways. The industry seemed to be one of his observations. I'll just give one quick example, and we'll move on. But right now we're showing something called French Exit that just started today at Cine. I'm supposed to be there at 5, but I don't think I'll make it. And it's edited by Hilda Razula, the daughter of our really good friends in Athens, Jed Razula in the English department, and Susie Wong. And And they were 90% done with the movie in March, when everything shut down, and she had to stay home with the two little kids, etc. And basically the director had, FedEx showed up with a bunch of huge, heavy boxes of equipment, and she had to set up all her editing equipment on the dining room table with her little kids around and finish the movie that way. So yeah, it's been, disruptive on so many personal levels and other big levels as well. So I didn't know if Anne wants to follow, or Neil, or who would like to build on Kate's don't panic message.
I mean, I can if you want me to. Neil, do you want to go? Okay. So then we'll do things a little bit out of order, or we're going in reverse, because Kate was talking a lot about exhibition, and I am interested always in audiences. And so I'm really interested in sort of what happens with pandemic viewing and what that tells us. And I think a lot of it is very much, as Kate said, that it is just accelerating or illustrating a lot of the trends that were already happening, the shift from going to the theaters, the shift from watching television on television and moving more towards streaming, and all of those things. And I think that was definitely helped also by the production schedules that streamers tend to hold. A shutdown in March is going to be catastrophic for a traditional broadcast television calendar, and it is not going to be for companies that shoot well in advance and shoot the entire season at once, and they're able to be 3/4 of the way finished with an entire season, and finish up the post-production and the editing at home, when you can't do that if you've only shot 2 weeks ahead in an episodic, or if you're shooting pilots, which is what was happening in March. And so I think that definitely helped speed up a lot of the transition to streaming, and I think that there's a lot of things for that. But there were also two observations that I had that I felt really notable about the ways in which this tells us something about maybe trends to come. One is, I was really struck by how many of the must-see hot pandemic titles do not fit the model of quality television that has really dominated TV for the last 2 decades. That was certainly the basis for how a lot of streaming originals got off the launching pad. Quality television is marked by things like anti-heroes, by long sequential drawn out narratives that involve a lot of seriality and a lot of complexity, a very dark aesthetic, aspiring to look cinematic. And you have, during pandemic, people watching Tiger King, and people watching, Framing Britney, and people rewatching Schitt's Creek endlessly. And I can't think of a show that is less anti-hero than Schitt's Creek. And so you have these things that become quite popular, and even the narrative fiction. So things like Bridgerton or Queen's Gambit, that are markedly different from a lot of the Breaking Bad and The Sopranos and things like that. And so I think that it might be something that in 5-10 years we look back and sort of mark a difference in trend of the kind of content that is coming out, and the kind of things that end up being popular. And then the other one is the push for collectivity that I think that we've seen in a lot of the home viewing things. And to me, it makes a lot of sense, right? Is that we are all sitting in our homes alone, but that doesn't mean that we want to feel like we're all sitting in our homes alone. And so we look for things, we watch The Last Dance or The Queen's Gambit, even if we don't care about sports or chess, so that we have something to talk about with other people. We go seeking out recommendation lists so that we have something that is going on that makes us feel like we are connected to other people, that even if you're not that interested in romance, you'll still watch Bridgerton. And so those kinds of things that are popular because they're popular with other people. And this also is the rise of the social viewing platforms is not an accident. And so Netflix Party, now Teleparty, really became, that is how I watched Tiger King, for example, was entirely on Netflix Party. Kate and I have spent many a night watching movies from 1995 on Hulu Watch Party or Amazon Watch Party or Scener or any of those kinds of platforms that let you mimic the movie-going experience without necessarily fully translating it. And I don't think that it's an accident that those things have become increasingly popular now, but I do think that it's notable because it is flying in the face of the trend towards fragmentation that has happened with media audiences for a very long time.
Terrific, thanks for touching on lots of great stuff. I don't do these viewing things. I just sit home and watch obscure French films all by myself. I get in a community, I guess, of viewing.
If you ever want to watch a movie from 1995, let us know. We got a
that's
lot
a
of
good point.
suggestions.
Okay, it's a deal. It's a deal. Yeah, Neil, what would you add?
All right, so I'll try to be I'll be optimistic, starting with the idea that the Renaissance did follow the Dark Ages, you know, and it could be argued that there's a lot more variety now because we went from a media landscape, especially streaming, that was just, there was a glut. I mean, there were over 535 scripted shows in 2019, and that's actually gone down a little bit now. But even when we had that many shows, you know, that high volume, people would always, you know, I'd hear complaints like it was my fault, you know, why are there so many shows? There are too many shows. And I would say, well, and people would say, how am I possibly ever going to have time to watch all of these shows? And I would say, well, you don't have to. Do you ever enter a library or a bookstore and say, there are too many books? How am I supposed to read all of these books? It's just, you have more choices, you know, and we do help each other with curation, like Anne referred to, where we ask, like, what's good? And I watch everything, either because I have no life or it's something I'm very interested in. But on the quick point of optimism, one thing is it's been really good for audiences to experience global content, movies, world cinema, and shows in their original language, in their original countries. Because how can we watch all of these shows? Who has time? Well, in 2020, we all had time. So people discovered shows from Spain and France and Israel and Italy and Germany. I mean, there's just so many amazing shows. And so I think that's really good. I was at the Cannes Film Festival in 2018 when Netflix was shut out because their movies did not premiere. I remember Beast of No Nation was not, you know, couldn't qualify for Cannes because it had not had a theatrical distribution. Ironically, all those movies that were banned from Cannes, the only way that audiences around the world could see those movies was on Netflix because they didn't get theatrical releases. So I like the accessibility that has been ushered in. From the screenwriting perspective, I can tell you that my favorite movie decade personally is the 1970s, when movies were about something and were, you know, much more character driven. And, you know, of course, there are always exceptions. We always get a Lady Bird or we get a Palm Springs or, you know, but for me as a screenwriter, my sensibility was never superheroes and big world building, tentpole blockbuster spectacles. I always wrote more like 70s kinds of movies and smaller, quirky character kind of things. And so I actually have a screenplay that I wrote, you know, 8 to 10 years ago that, you know, who would want to, that movie was not a movie that would play in movie theaters. It wasn't where the business was going. Now there's lots of places for a low budget, dysfunctional family comedy. So that's been positive for me personally. Also, another positive is the limited release, limited series. It used to be they were very difficult to sell limited series because everybody wanted shows that could run for at least 5 seasons. Well, now, you know, we want something new, something different. So I think the success of Queen's Gambit and Watchmen and the limited series is just because people want more variety to keep renewing their monthly subscriptions. And also for me personally, just animation, which I have 3 animated movies in production now, has not been impacted by COVID very much because people are basically just working at computers, and I've just been Zooming, and these are international co-productions. So I've been able to work with people all over the world, all during 2020. And finally, something for production that I think is a welcome change, even though COVID protocols are heinous and nobody would ever welcome them. One thing that has shifted, it not formally yet, but typically in production, you have a 12-hour day. And if you ever worked on set, everybody's always going, you got to make your day, you got to make your day, you can't go into overtime. It's a long conversation, but most productions have voluntarily shifted to a 10-hour day because of COVID, because the time it takes to put your PP gear, what is it called? PPE on and off, just to use the restroom, just to eat, adds so much time and stress to the day. And everybody I know, I don't know a single person who works in production who is not happier for a 10-hour day. 12 hours is very inhumane. And especially if you're driving a long distance to a location, you're talking, I work these 15, 16-hour days, and they're brutal. And there are legal turnaround times, but for actors, it's especially hard. And so I hope we shift practices to a 10-hour day. Even if it adds time to the shooting schedule, it's a much more humane practice. So that's my 2 cents.
Sorry, gotta unmute myself. Thank you very much. No, that's a lot of great perspectives, and we'll come back and discuss a number of these things in more detail. And especially that point, we're about to talk to our friends in streaming. But that point about the global stuff is very interesting, as Kate will verify. At Cine, for example, we have things that we can show just for a couple days on the weekend. Normally you have to book a whole week. And so we're showing movies we wouldn't maybe otherwise show, and we're streaming things otherwise. But yeah, French films, Danish films. We've got another round, for example, going streaming right now, which normally would be in the theaters. But also in television. I mean, the Call My Agent, the French show. I've had so many people, say, "Oh my God, is that going to come back another year?" So it's really interesting, the wide variety of stuff. My brother's wife is constantly saying, "Do you know more French shows?" So that's kind of never happened before. So you're right that there is this feeling of exploring other things, and especially short format is a good point. Well, Kelsey or Jianna, who would like to talk about what this has meant for from your perspectives in your current positions? Either one want to go first? Jianna, since you were half.
Yeah, I can go first.
A24 and then Netflix, maybe it'd be a good transition.
Sure. Well, I'm going to first say my optimistic point, which is about movie theaters and not streamers, because at my heart, I am a moviegoer. But I was thinking about film history studies and how in the 1950s, advent of television, everyone was very anxious that it meant the end of theaters and the end of theatrical viewing. And then I think that was rise of CinemaScope and how do you eventize the theatrical experience again? So I have hope that doesn't just mean, no offense to the viewers, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think that there's going to be, this was mentioned before, but the collective experience of being in a movie theater together. I am excited to see how theaters and distributors find just something interesting that does draw us back, because it's always happened in the past, even post Great Depression, it happened. So, and I also just saw my first movie again, so I think I'm especially jazzed. My other point of optimism for COVID is that I think that the industry has become a bit decentralized in a way that I'm actually really excited by. So I think probably a lot of students, even though I can't see you on the call, might have the mindset now of New York or LA or bust, and that is it. And I think what I've experienced, granted, I'm in New York now and I just moved from LA, but I do think that the fact that you can work from anywhere and apply for jobs anywhere has sort of leveled the playing field in a really, really exciting way. And I think that that's going to remain, where hopefully not just these giant companies, but, maybe smaller production companies will open Georgia branches or New Orleans branches when we do get back in the world. And I think there will still be remote aspects of everything we do. And also for the students, I think studios are going to be hungry for really new IP and really exciting content. I don't know about you guys, but I have so much fatigue from the movies of this year. I'm just we're talking about the same 4 movies over and over and over again. So I think now that production's getting back into gear, take this time and do write your scripts and do have your concepts, and then know that I think everyone's going to be really excited for fresh stuff. Okay, so the A24 to Netflix pipeline, I think what's been really interesting is you've seen in A24 who are very dependent on the theatrical model and didn't really make the choice this year to push things onto streaming services. I know that they did a stunt with Minari where they had an A24 screening room, which to me was a really interesting thought of ooh, could studios just start streaming their films, but people could buy virtual tickets, and that's another way in. but you'll notice that like they haven't done that yet for Isola, and a lot of dates have gotten pushed back because I think collectively as a movie industry, we all still depend on theaters. And I will say now, even with Netflix, I work specifically on Netflix's awards movies and TV shows. And for awards, theater is like king. You have to have a theatrical window to even qualify most of the time for these award shows or for Cannes or for different festivals. So I think that it's important to remember that these streamers, even though, you know, I have my whole litany of feelings about that, Netflix owns 2 movie theaters. So like there's still some, whether it's just to kind of keep up cred amongst the industry where like, you know, that the other people you're working with really care about the theatrical experience, or if it's an understanding that at least for right now, that isn't going to change. I have confidence that even the streamers are going to still be excited to get their films back into the theaters, especially because like this year, I don't know if you all felt this, but in awards season, one of the craziest things for me personally, because I work on all of the editorial and social and like that for awards movies, but typically awards season is 4 months long, and this year it's been 9 months long. So like to have to figure out how to talk about Mank, to your point, with the online community and like with people on Twitter and keep it fresh has been very difficult. But I think that it's also tricky when you have these really massive big films on streamers like Aroma, like a Mank, like I'm like, what other movies have we put out? That if they were experienced in the theater, that might renew a different appreciation when people were to watch them again on a streamer. And then a few quick final things that have been interesting to observe. I know we mentioned like different jobs that have gone remote. The coolest thing for me is to watch how with these awards films in the production aspect, like Fincher's Mank, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross scored the entire film remotely. So like imagine orchestra, I can't speak, like violinists playing in their kitchen and recording themselves and then them all piecing it together in post. So that's been crazy to watch. For us, we've done in terms of how to like market a film where you don't have billboards that really matter anymore, or like theatrical flyers or lobby cards. What do you do? So I think like we saw this year, social became king, but social also, it was like an incredibly difficult year. So when do you talk about movies? When do you not talk about movies? Because the world is in flames. Has been very interesting to approach. And last note is just like doing photo shoots over Zoom and sending people iPhones that you can see their feed to capture a video. Like very brave new world, very weird. I'm excited to be back in person. But regardless, I think it shows we have human ingenuity. I think the industry will get decentralized, and I think there will be a ton more opportunity very soon. And I also was watching Bridgerton and all of that while watching the French films. That's me.
All right, thank you very much, Jianna. And Kelsey, you can wrap up, and then we'll come back and talk about the different aspects of things that have come up and answer lots of questions. So Kelsey, yeah, what are your perspectives on the industry today?
I'm happy to jump in, but Dr. Fortmueller, did you have something you wanted to?
No, I just wanted to add sort of part of like what Jianna was saying about just the shipping of all the stuff has been really like phones and cameras, and the sort of virtual directing stories this year have been really great. The others, but I would also add, just to kind of like give some of the history of some of this and how this worked, is like for voice actors have actually been doing this for a while now. Some of this sort of like, and so have actors, right? So like, I think this is another place where there are ways in which the industry was prepared for some of this, whether this was about actors who already had experience self-taping. I did a lot of interviews with voice actors for my other book. So a lot of voice actors already have booths in their homes, or at least they have insulated closets and some equipment. So they have some of these skills already. So I think there's also some interesting ways that that stuff got accelerated, but then I'll just add that and turn it over to Kelsey.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has made really good points, and I feel like there are a million things that I could spin off of from all these points. But actually, just even talking about that, we have one show that's coming out later this year called Only Murderers in the Building that just recently wrapped up in New York City. And we actually had one of our directors on the show tested positive for COVID, like very late in her tenure. So she only had like a few days left. But obviously, you know, protocol is if you test positive, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. Anybody that you've exposed also has to quarantine for 2 weeks. So it's been really interesting to see the ways that people have adapted to these sorts of problems. So even though she still had a few days left to direct, they had somebody else come in to direct, but she FaceTimed that person the entire shoot. So even though she wasn't like physically present, she was still like, you know, somewhat like omnipresent of being able to like see what was going on, give her input. So that just jumping off of that point. But yeah, so I work in originals production and post for Hulu. So a lot of the points that I was going to bring up are really just examples of things that we have gone through that maybe if I were a student, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of like, oh, that's something that a production maybe would have had to adjust to or thought about. So I know back, you know, Dr. Fortmueller was mentioning the beginning of the pandemic, which doesn't, you know, seems like a lifetime ago, but especially those days when all of our production shut down in March, our productions were shut down for at least like 4 or 5 months. And during that time, we actually had to, there were like 2 or 3 of us on the production team that had to run like back to work scenarios on all of our shows. So essentially we were taking all of our schedules and we were just running these hypothetical scenarios of like, okay, well, let's say that production starts back May 1st. You know, what does that schedule look like? And what are the, you know, earliest launch that we could launch on the service? And we did that for like about 6 months. And it was really trying to try to like guess, you know, if we're able to get the stage space and if everything works out really well, and if we have the availability, you know, it's really anyone's guess. And it still kind of is like, we're all still adapting, but still no one knows anything for certain. I mean, even at Hulu, we don't know for sure when we're going back into the offices. Like we have a vague idea, but a lot of it's dependent on, you know, vaccination rollout and really what the protocols are going to be. And also throwing it back to earlier in the pandemic, especially, hopefully this isn't too controversial, but, you know, the United States wasn't handling COVID super well. So a lot of our productions had to then look abroad, which, you know, maybe we were going to have something film in Los Angeles or New York, but COVID really wasn't doing well in either of those places. So we had to shift a lot of our productions to Canada or Australia, and sometimes on really short notice. But of course, Hulu wasn't the only company that thought of doing that. Really, everybody was doing that. So, you know, we had one situation where, you know, it can be very expensive to shut down a production. It can be, you know, it's tens of thousands of dollars. And because everyone was like moving their productions to Canada, and we had to shut down our production for a day because we weren't getting our COVID tests back in time. You know, crews get tested depending on which zone you're in every 3 to 5 days. And if you're not able to get your COVID tests back in time, you can't risk that. You can't risk the health and safety of your crew. So we had to shut down because everyone's getting COVID tested, which is a great thing, but it also causes a lot of backlog. So one of our productions, The Handmaid's Tale, because it's, you know, it's a very well-funded show, just decided, well, we're going to build a COVID lab on campus. So they built their own lab so that, you know, they didn't have to go to like these external vendors, and they could just have a lab for the cast and crew, which, you know, is one way to problem solve that one. And also kind of, I guess this last point is also with having to reschedule so many productions, it's really like a never ending puzzle. Like you have so many schedules of not only your shows, but, you know, if you have a show that has, you know, an A-list celeb, they probably have multiple projects down the pipeline. So it's, you know, are we in first position? Are we in second position? If we're not in first position, then we kind of have to wait until they film this other project. So there's so many factors that you have to keep in mind. And you also have to consider, you know, people's, you know, how comfortable they are going back to work. We've had a situation on one of our shows where, you know, one of the leads of the show basically said like, hey, I really want to come back to work, but I don't feel comfortable doing so. And you can't really argue with people about, you know, whether they're comfortable or not. If they're not, they're not, and it's the end of the story. So then it kind of comes to our side. We have to wonder, well, is there a world in which we change the creative of the show and this person's not a part of it? Or do we wait? And so in our case, we waited, and, that show was supposed to film last fall, probably about September, and it's now going into production 1 month from now. So it's almost been a year that it's been pushed back because this person was like, I'm not comfortable until I'm vaccinated. I live with my parents. I want them to be vaccinated. And, personally, I think that's something that's, it's hard to argue with. So those are just, I guess, a few examples of things that I've seen on the production side.
Oh, terrific. And I actually have a question for both you and Jianna in a second, but I also, as they know from my classes, I like to pull out Cahiers du Cinéma, the French film journal. And the March one on the front is the politics of streaming. Are the streaming platforms going to domesticate cinema? And it's really nice, but they've got this great, I should have put it in the PowerPoint, but they've got this great article, US Go Home. Is this the end of La Fin des Salles? Is this the end of theaters in the United States? And they've got a film forum picture there of temporary closed. Watch movies online from our site. Keep donating money to us. Same thing as Cine, the notion of we're a theater, but we got to try to survive. I'm just curious, and I know you can't speak for the whole corporations, but so for Netflix and Hulu, for the rest of the world, they must feel pretty good, right? Like, we're only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I assume, not to say they're just taking advantage of the situation, but I'm assuming this really catapults them onto a next level in terms of the industry, in terms of Hollywood. I mean, that they are really going to be like super major players now, more than they would have been. That's safe to say, I assume?
I will quickly say, I think yes, but to me it's hard because it's like Netflix now is so vertically integrated or horizontally, where it's like it's not a traditional studio. I'll just compare the two beasts that I know, which is like an independent A24 versus a Netflix. Netflix can do the production, distribution, marketing, streaming, everything all in one. So I think that what we're actually starting to see is now there is like literally the streaming wars. So there's this, even if you're growing at a constant rate, there's also the equal push to like get overall exclusive deals with all of the filmmakers that you can, and like get as much content as you can. And I think that what we're seeing is like a lot of swelling. And so I'm always curious of like, how are all of the streamers going to split the finite number of subscribers that there are in the world? But that said, I will say a cool thing I've been able to work on at Netflix is that they acquired the Paris Theater in New York. So I've been able to do like branding and whatever work with them. And it is going to operate for the most part like a repertory cinema, but then like we'll get to play Netflix movies during awards windows and we'll see. But I think like that, at least to me, some encouragement that they can be two separate fellows. But yeah, all to say, sorry, the summary of that is I think streamers are competing against streamers and trying to figure out what that even means and what the end goal is. And I think streamers are like, in one sense, they're clients, like that's who they're selling content to. So it's just a matter of if they all just start selling everything straight to SVOD, or if everyone still respects the need for the theatrical window, which I think is what's going to be curious in the next few years.
Good point.
Yeah, and to jump off of like Gianna's point too, I think, Hulu's kind of in a different position from Netflix in that, we were acquired by Disney about, a few years ago now, and Hulu has definitely felt the effects of that. So it's not only, at least this is just my personal opinion, like is Hulu competing against, like other streamers, but there's also kind of like this internal, like very odd feeling of, Disney also has Disney Plus, which is obviously a streamer that they're very much so pushing. And then we also have an international service recently, Star, in which a lot of Hulu titles are going to be going to Star. So we've had shows at Hulu, like we were the ones that had acquired the show Mysterious Benedict Society, and it was Hulu that had worked on that show from beginning to end. But then Disney kind of stepped in and said, actually, we think this title would be really great for Disney Plus. it's more like family friendly. So it's an interesting dynamic of, not only having to consider other companies, but we're also like working together and then like also kind of not. And I think that's also has to do with, any sort of corporate change. There's some pain points that you have to work through, but, we're definitely moving towards a model too of a lot of, the content that we license. We're moving towards 60 to 70% of it is going to be from Disney owned studios. So, you think of like the 20th Century Fox, or formerly known as Fox, ABC Studios. Those are going to be the studios that we're taking a lot more meetings from, and we're, acquiring a lot more of that content because, it's the Disney owned brand and we're all, one team. So those have just been some, changes from over the past few years.
Oh, terrific. All right, thank you. Any comments between each other before we start to look at and ask? Well, we're certainly asking now for any kind of questions and comments, but other things you want to expand on? Yeah, Neil, you got.
Well, I was just going to expand that. Of course, I miss the communal experience of sitting in a movie theater. There's nothing like it. It's the magic of movies. However, and I'm still optimistic, that movies are not going to go away, and there will still be big. Like, I can't wait. I want to see the new James Bond movie, for example, on the big screen. I'm going to wait. But the socioeconomics is a huge factor. You mentioned that the movie business bounced back after the Great Depression, but in the 1930s, it cost 25 cents to go to the movies. And the ArcLight theaters that just closed in LA that I loved, but it was $15 for a movie ticket. And when you add concessions, it's more now. They had memberships for a while. And then if you add popcorn and drinks and you take your family and you pay for parking in LA, you're talking well over $100 to see a movie. Whereas at home, it's included in your subscription. The other thing I wanted to mention is we're seeing great diversity. The whole Oscars So White campaign and Black Lives Matter and the movements that are greatly impacting and expanding so that we have inclusivity and representation and diversity. All of these movies that we're seeing now, many of them are award contenders. It'd be tough for them to survive in a theatrical release experience. And I love that they're available. And some of the best movies I've seen this year, from Judas and the Black Messiah, Trial of Chicago 7, and so many, Minari. These are movies that it'd be very hard for them to, the box office is going to be a big, always is a factor when you're doing theatrical release. So I like that. And the last point, China. It used to be that no matter what you could offset box office with a China release based on a quota system. And we're talking about maybe 350 million people in the US versus about 1.4 billion people in China. The Chinese movie business is now thriving, and they have figured it out in a way and are making movies that are doing extremely well and making their own blockbusters instead of importing everything. That's a huge factor in everything we're talking about, I believe, because it's probably, it's very dominant. So those are my little extra points to mention.
Yeah, I sort of feel the same way in a lot of this. I feel like I am a terrible judge of these things. I love movie theaters so much. I worked at a movie theater all through high school. And that was what I did then when I was in LA. I worked for the National Association of Theater Owners. Like I am a big movie theater person. And so I love going to the theaters. I'm always a little bit like, am I the only one? Am I an anomaly, or am I more the norm? But even as close as 2-3 years ago, all of the research was very, very clear that the people who went to the movies the most frequently were also the ones that streamed the most content at home. And so your heaviest streamers were also your most frequent moviegoers, because they were people that just like to consume media in multiple forms. And so it wasn't necessarily a zero-sum game between them. And I do think that the pandemic has sort of thrown a bit of a wrench into that, in large part because things like release windows are changing when it's not a choice, right? Like if I literally have to choose if I'm going to see the same movie on my HBO Max subscription, or if I'm going to go to a movie theater. And that really wasn't the choice that you were making with anything other than sort of limited day and date releases. But then Disney is doing the different model, right? Like they're doing that you have to pay an extra 20 or 30 bucks to watch it at home. And so then it becomes a different choice, and sort of how the revenue models are going to play out versus how the affective attachment that we have to like paying one off. I mean, honestly, you have to buy like 3 or 4 Disney movies on the premium in order for it not to be more expensive, because Disney Plus is so cheap versus HBO Max. And so like, but our effective attachment to how much we're willing to like drop 30 bucks on this new Disney movie, when that feels really problematic, but then is it really problematic? I think are things that are still shaking out. So I do think that there's room for both, but I don't know that I necessarily can guess what it's going to look like.
No, those are great points. And just to make sure everybody in the audience understands, yeah, that historically the window was always really determined by distributors and the big studios in terms of things would open first at the movie theaters, then there would be a small window perhaps, and then maybe go to other options of where you might be able to see it. So now the fact that Warner's is going to have things opening simultaneously, etc., it just kind of breaks the whole financial system. Also for and something Kate knows much more about, but also for talent. If you're a big name actor or a writer or a cinematographer, etc., a big chunk of your money comes from the box office. So the whole notion of when and where the producers get their money back is also going to have a huge effect on everybody's paycheck as well. Anyway, Kate, you're going to add something.
Yeah, I was going to say, and so now I ended optimistic, and so now I'll just come in with my normal mode of wet blanket. Kelsey's very familiar with this, which is where I'm very comfortable. So I think there's a couple of things that I would say in terms of like how the pandemic did shift things in really meaningful ways. One is, I think, because like theaters, like NATO has been, like John Fithian is like on record for years, like that distribution windows is our #1 concern. This is the biggest threat to the theater industry. There's quotes of him saying that 2007, 2005, Bob Iger's like, we need to shorten the windows. We need to shorten the windows. So this has been happening. The pandemic just made it happen. And so it then shifted the leverage, right? So studios do make a lot of money off of theatrical. Disney makes a ton of money theatrically, but this sort of basically put them in a point position to say like, well, you know, like, and they don't have to release their data, right? So they can say, well, we think this was a success. This was great. And that's all you're going to hear, because all that does is send theater owners like just scrambling, right, to negotiate, which is what happened over the summer. And so it just sort of shifts that balance of power in certain ways that I think brings theater owners to the table and is forcing them to shorten windows when maybe they weren't ready to. That being said, like hindsight's 2020, but maybe they should have had these conversations like a while ago instead of kind of clinging to the long window. Maybe these should have been shortened. Maybe they should have negotiated a percentage when they had better leverage. Obviously, you can't foresee a pandemic, but this was something that happened that shifted that. I think to go off that, the other thing that I think is really troubling for talent and troubling for a lot of people is the shift in terms of data. Netflix as being the sort of example of like, you know, we take what they give us, right? Sort of like they tell us Bird Box is successful and that's all we have. And there's no external verification, and they will always challenge like anyone who's putting stuff out there. So I think sort of shifts in terms of data reporting, how much is sort of given to talent, what they can do with that, I think is all not great for labor. I feel like we were also like gearing up for a strike. I was so ready, Neil, for the Writers Guild to strike this year. And nobody's gonna strike during a pandemic. I get it. Like you don't really have much, you're not shutting down production, right? When it's already shut down, people want to get back to work. So do you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to say, but the Writers Guild did have a big victory against the agencies and against pandemic. So
yes,
I feel pretty satisfied.
Yes, no, totally. And like an ongoing and huge victory.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I think there are some things that like continue to be things that need to be sort of worked out. for not just the Writers Guild, but the other guilds that kind of follow suit in their negotiations. And those things didn't happen. And, you know, in the way that these things, like over time, I think, you know, labor builds on previous contracts. And so anytime something slips by, it makes it harder the next go round. So that's sort of the thing, like, that's always what, like, I want talent to get their piece of the pie, always. And so that's the kind of thing that when I see that sort of slipping by, I start to, yeah.
You're right. Because creatives are getting paid less for the most part.
Yeah.
That's true.
And that's the other, I would say also the other point that's like the flip maybe for me in terms of like, we're seeing more diverse creators with limited series and stuff like that. But what's the sort of ceiling for your career as we get more diverse television? If people aren't getting compensated as much, what's that relationship? And that's, I'm gonna say, I told you I was gonna be a wet blanket. So these are kind of, I think for me, like the backdrop of some of these concerns about what does this mean for labor in the future? I apologize, I'm kind of losing my voice. I've spent all day teaching, and so this sort of happens. But yeah, sort of what does this mean for labor in the future? Is this kind of like a lost period? Will there be additional struggles? But I'll tip it over to Neil. So.
I was just going to say, does anybody have questions who's
please.
called in, or would they put them in the chat box? Does anybody else have?
Yeah,
anything?
we'll stick around a while. Yeah, we go a while, usually till at least 5:15 or so. So feel free to ask questions. I also find it just really interesting, and from what many of you have said, and especially, I mean, Gianna too, that whole notion of Netflix still having some faith in cinema, and they're also still using movie directors well known as their sort of prestige A-list. So getting a Scorsese, doing work back a couple years ago, doing Cuarón's Roma, etc. But the other thing we haven't really mentioned is that film festivals, in addition to theatrical openings, the fact that film festivals have either got so minimized but shut down. So not being able to go to Telluride, not being able to go to, Venice was open, but Cannes now is going to come back, Toronto though. So that whole idea of being able to get out and get shown for movies like, I mean, that's where I saw Roma first, was at Telluride, and Gianna has been to Telluride a number of times as well, where you got to see things that might otherwise not break out. So that whole idea of who gets noticed, the smaller films, but so things like certainly like Nomadland, which should be seen on a screen. It's just stunning in a movie theater. Nomadland kind of films, Minari, I think would do much better if there was a really normal theatrical season, but also film festival season. They'd be known well, rather than some algorithm telling us, oh, you might want to watch this kind of thing. It'd be nice to have the film festivals help do that. But anyway, I'll watch for questions. Other comments from the panelists?
I was just going to add that I'll be curious to see if there is a 1 week theatrical distribution requirement to be eligible for different awards. It's been a good news, bad news thing, because there were more movies eligible, for this Oscar period than ever. I mean, I think there were over 150 documentaries that qualified that would have never, ever had the chance, because so few of them get a play, even just for a week in a theater. So I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a whole adjustment period, like Kate was saying. I don't know where we land on the other side of that. Film festivals also, I love film festivals, but it was such a way to traditionally shop your films, and there's an elitist element to it in terms of the costs and the carbon footprint, and it's tough because there's positives and negatives on all sides.
Well, that's a good point. I just want to, and I should also mention, Gianna used to work at Cine, and so as I'll just give an example of what he mentions with the theatrical opening that allowed to traditionally, you needed. So when Roma was up and won the Academy Award, they gave a tiny window to allow people to show it. So at Cine, we did great, and we begged to keep it longer. They said, nope, that's it. Whereas the opposite is something like Star Wars. To get a Star Wars, you have to guarantee. Same thing with Black Panther. We had to guarantee we'd run it 7 days a week, 3 times a day for a month. Well, even Star Wars, after 2 weeks, it kind of, you're paying high rate for it. So I think the industry's relation to theaters is gonna be ongoing and changing. The theatrical release and its relationship to streaming is changing. So I think it's very hard to anticipate in the next few years for a lot of different kinds of, especially medium and small productions. Will it be better or worse for them? Are things going to have to just go straight to negotiating with the Netflixes and Apples of the world? If you're a small independent filmmaker, will you still be able to get in theaters? How many theaters are going to remain? It's really a tough question.
I had one note just on the awards of it all, because I think this year is extremely interesting and very weird. Typically, there's, like, you guys follow Gold Derby, which I don't encourage, but you can see a trend typically of, like, if someone wins the BAFTA, they're going to win the Oscar and whatever. And this year it's been all over the place because no one knows. There's no like festival where there's consensus coming out of it of like what the film community thinks of a movie. So I think it's been fascinating to watch. Like, every award show has had a different Best Actress win Best Actress this year. And also you have films like, if we just look at the Oscars, it's like The Father. No one has seen The Father. Where can you see The Father? But it has 6 Oscar nominations. Minari, which didn't play the streamer game, has 6 Oscar nominations. And I think, to me, like, Nomadland is the last vestige of what people saw at Sundance and have the memory of like that collective festival experience. So it's all to say, and I mean, this is again, speaking from Netflix working in awards, like it technically, like we had everything working for us, like big movies, everyone can see it, but still there are these retainers where everybody's like, no, we're still sticking to like the way that this is supposed to work, which I find very encouraging and cool. And part of that is probably because of working the checkout at Cine for 2 years and whatever. But yeah, just to say, award season, fascinating to watch. The award shows, terrible to watch.
Yes.
Horrible. I never will watch a Zoom award show ever again after the 25th. But
well, you know, one other quick follow-up to what you just said about, you know, most people who are eligible to vote don't watch the movies in movie theaters. We get screeners. It used to be the coveted DVDs that would start coming, and everybody was so jealous and going, can I borrow it? And, you know, you can get arrested by the FBI if you let somebody watch yours. This year I have a whole pile of screeners and I'm like, does anybody want to watch any of these? You know, my kids, people are like, no, everything's streaming. I think Promising Young Woman was one of the ones that was late to the game, but like, it's just ironic because people have been watching movies at home for decades. Well, not decades. Well, yeah, probably decades with screeners.
Richard, there are a few questions in the Q&A.
Yes, do you want to pick?
I was going to say, go for it. You're moderator. I just wanted to make sure you saw him.
Darn, it means I have to read. Yeah, Mary's asking basically, yeah, and I think this builds on some things we've discussed. What about standalone films when so many things are in franchises and other things? Is it going to be tougher and tougher to do for individual standalone films? I assume in theatrical as well, theatrical releases beyond the sort of Marvels. And yeah, I was just saying, I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody has any more to say about individuals, you know, independent small films.
Well, see, in the department that we're in, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of students who want to be filmmakers in various ways. And one of the things that I always try to make clear is how much of a bottleneck distribution is. And so it's like, you can make a movie and you can get your movie out there, but how do you get people to know that your movie exists out there? And so like, you look at Netflix's catalog, you look at Hulu's catalog, they're monstrously huge. They're enormously vast. And so, you know, finding your way through them and finding other people who are not like related to you to be able to know that your movie is there to watch is really, really hard. And I think that will become even more noticeable when you are talking about films that don't have the same relied upon festival circuit to rely on, that don't have the same relied upon distribution markets to work on, that don't have the same theatrical releases markets to work on, and then they just drop on streaming service and they have no franchise name. also it becomes very, very difficult to even know how to market them, which is not something that I have any expertise in, but also to know how to find your way through them. The algorithms on streaming services are actually terrible in terms of helping you find things that you don't know that you want to watch, but you do want to watch. They're appallingly bad at it. And so like, if it is a known thing, I mean, Disney Plus, that's how their entire thing is organized with, like, these are their brands: Star Wars, National Geographic, Pixar, like, which of these do you want to watch? And we'll start there. And if you don't have that, I think it's very, very easy to get lost in the shuffle. But at the same time, I think that if there is a large scale dismantling of theatrical releases, I actually think that Marvel Cinematic Universe will feel it more than anyone, because they need that money in order to fund wildly expensive movies.
I have one thought, which maybe this is like blindly optimistic, but I think that smaller budget films are going to be the easiest films to start making again, because it's going to be small crews. Like, COVID is making everything tiny and short hours, which was mentioned earlier. So I actually think, like, again, hoping for the renaissance, that people are craving new IP, smaller budgets are going to get off the ground. I also think we've seen a lot of smaller independent studios, a lot of times run by like actresses that decide they want to become producers, but beginning these smaller outlets that will get first look deals with the Netflixes and A24s and whoever. And I actually think, like, if you're a student right now, start looking at the smaller production companies. And even if, for instance, like, I'm not at this time a filmmaker, I'm somebody who works in like the marketing and distribution and creative of that, but I do think there's a lot of avenues into the industry. I do think these smaller distributors are all getting off their feet because the bigger studios are like, shit, we need help. We need someone sifting through the mess to figure out what is good. Yeah, that was just to say, I feel excited and confident about that. Also, another A24 plug, I do still think there's smaller independent studios investing in really, really special narratives that are coming up. Like, if you even just go on Deadline and like look at what some of these smaller studios are acquiring, it's very exciting. So I remain hopeful.
No, that's really helpful. And Chris Steeving has says hello and has a question in there for you, Jianna. As long as you were speaking, he wants to know: is Netflix gonna buy a string of theaters, theater chain at this point? Do we know?
I've asked this question directly to the top, and there's no. To be honest, like, Netflix's plan to have theaters right now is because in the past world pre-COVID, to have a premiere in Hollywood or a premiere in New York, it can be like $500,000. But if you own your space, it's free. So I think that a lot of these giant conglomerate studios are like, this is a place for us to exhibit our movies and have a glossy premiere and play them on the week of Oscars voting. And then, for instance, the Egyptian in LA, which they own, American Cinematheque is still the programmer. So like, they can program with full free avail and play everyone's movies. It's just the streamer has say on specific dates. That's the same situation with Paris. The programmer is the ex-programmer from Museum of Moving Image. So like, I saw Dog Day Afternoon there last week and it was awesome. It was a 35mm print and it was like, it was awesome. So I think what I have to remind myself, and maybe this is, you all are seeing my split situation, but I think we have to remember, ultimately, streamers are tech companies. They're tech companies first and film studios second. And so though there's really creative and awesome people thinking about those plans of like, would it be smart to have a chain of movie theaters? Ultimately, like, does that serve clicks on the site where the tech is? I don't know. So yeah, I don't know that I have no answer for that, but at least right now, I have been personally pleased with how they've handled the theaters that they own. And I will be very curious with the ArcLight and Pacific theaters, because those were like where I went in LA every day. If there's going to be like, everyone's like, will a celebrity step in and pay for this? No. Will another studio buy it? So I think we will get in an interesting time of seeing if more tech companies buy up theaters and what they do with them. But long way of answering that question, Dr. Seaman.
I was gonna say, per ArcLight, also that's an awards question, because that was like when you were in LA, if you were premiering for 2 weeks, whatever in LA, it was like we always knew you go to ArcLight. In New York, it's like a different kind of navigating mess, but LA, it was always ArcLight. So, and apparently that's the most profitable theater. ArcLight Hollywood is the most profitable theater in America. So somebody, I don't know, if nobody picks up that real estate, I think
How ambivalent will we all feel if it's Amazon though?
Well, that's the other thing I say. That's not what I want either. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, there's also the question, and I think we've kind of addressed it in different ways, but so for young creatives today, I think this has been optimistic in a lot of ways, but yeah, getting out there, finding out what people are doing. But I do think a lot of the, as you mentioned, smaller films are going to get made, get into places. There's a nostalgia for them, I think, right now, maybe more than there had been in the past as well. But yeah, the landscape certainly for theaters is going to be changing. There aren't that many cines and plazas out there that are gonna feature some of the small, lesser known films. And part of this is also about ethics. And I think it's really for our students who want to write and direct, etc. A lot of them don't go to movies. I'm not going to shame people, but a lot of students, they don't want to spend any money on a movie, so the fact that they want somebody to pay them eventually, but they're going to try to, watch things illegally off other people's streaming. But I just think, looking at what's going on at Sundance, following what things are going on, rather than letting the algorithms at Amazon, et cetera, tell you what to watch is really important. And keeping up on the news of what things are coming out, I think is real important. And it's part of our job also to sort of highlight, as educators, highlight what's going on and what other things are out there in the media landscape. Any other final questions or comments? Yeah, Kate?
I just wanted to say, like, to this last question, I think asking about budding filmmakers from a creative perspective, I guess the thing I would sort of end on is that I think sort of how it will, I don't think that we can really say to what extent like it'll affect a generation in terms of your creativity. But I do think this is a historically very important moment. I feel like for me personally, this experience has changed a lot of how I like exist in the world, how I respond to other humans, how I behave in public space, all of these things, right? It has shaped my behavior in countless ways. It has shaped my behavior to like relationship to kind of like, I don't know, like my job, like, because I wrote a book at home without going to an archive, which was really strange. So I think that some of how it affects, how this will affect budding filmmakers in the future depends on how much you are reflecting on this process and have been reflecting on this pandemic as it has been happening. So I think it would be, for those of you who are sort of like taking stock of your life, I think it's sit down and sort of like continually reflect on this. I don't think that we're just going to kind of like emerge from this and young filmmakers are just going to be like, oh yeah, I forgot about that thing that happened. This is not a forgettable moment. I don't know. I will say also, just in relation to, I cannot believe I taught silent cinema without spending like a day on the Spanish flu. How was this not the biggest thing, right? So there are certain things that I've had to kind of reflect on in that regard. So I think that, if you're a young filmmaker, a creative individual, you should always be sort of observing and taking stock of the world around you. And this is no different. So
that's a great observation. And Neil and I have been very active. Oh, just saying, Jianna, we've been very active in assessing all kinds of things around, but like it's also really optimistic, I would say, about production in Georgia. It's a good thing you're in Georgia. But yeah, almost every soundstage, we hear about people pulling out, but right now almost every soundstage in the state is booked. We do have like the second largest soundstages in the country now, with Trillett south of Atlanta. That's all booked for a Spider-Man movie right now. But things are booming, and there will be a whole lot of production coming forth in very near future. Yeah, Jianna.
I have two quick notes. One that is my biggest is like Georgia. Like take this time right now to figure out who's making things. Like this is my note that I always give everybody, but like start with what you love. So look up movies that you love, see who worked on them, see what production company made them, see what writers made them, see where they're located. Like, start from the thing you love. A lot of it's happening in Georgia. Don't be stressed out about LinkedIn. And for filmmakers, like, don't be stressed out about having to make like your first feature right now. I would say spend time to learn, watch a shit ton of movies, and sorry. And my last point of optimism is that I think what I felt this year is the power of like when you are stuck inside your apartment for an entire year, that movies are just the most transportive thing ever. So figure out what it is about your experience that's unique and like what part of the world do you want to show, because I think like that is, movies are the fastest way to build empathy and to travel. I've been watching a lot of Romer and like feeling like I'm on the French seaside, even though I'm in a very small apartment. So I think just from a creative perspective, this year more than anything has taught us to like tell your story and then asterisk, look at what's happening in Georgia, because it's time to build the creative fortress there, because it should happen.
Perfect, thank you. And Kelsey, what are you gonna add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in a quick note too, just to all the students on the call. I completely agree with what Jianna just said. Please try to consume as much content as you can. I know Dr. Fortmueller would always tell us that in school, and it really is true. You know, you should always be a student of the art and of the industry that you're working in, but also, you know, really work on maintaining relationships as well, and, you know, reaching out to people. I know networking can be like really odd and like strange. But really, like the, you know, the students that have graduated and, you know, we're now working in the industry, you know, we are more than help. I can't speak for everyone, but I would think that most people, you know, are really happy to help, and we want to see, you know, UGA students coming out and working in the industry, whether it be in Atlanta or New York or LA or wherever you choose to go. So, you know, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to answer questions that you have. Or if, you know, we can just give some general guidance, we're more than happy to. So please, you know, don't hesitate to reach out. You know, everyone on the call here, I'm sure, you know, has our contact information, you know, and I'm happy for them to pass it on. So yeah, please reach out.
Terrific. What a great panel. This has been terrific. Very, very fun. Any last words from anybody else? And yeah, and ultimately our goal with our own programs, undergrad and graduate, but also with the new MFA program, is to build entrepreneurial filmmakers here, people who will have a reason to stay in the area, and build and tell Southern stories in particular. So all this has been just marvelous advice from everybody. So I guess we'll wrap it up. Thanks again for Dave Marr in the shadows, who's been controlling everything for us. And thank you all for taking time on a Friday afternoon. Next fall, we'll hopefully have a live in-person one, but we can have wonderful people like Kelsey and Jianna Zoom in nonetheless in the future. So thank you all, and appreciate it. Have a good weekend. And again, see a movie in a theater when you can.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Bye, everyone.